I still don't know what I expected when I picked up her phone. Late nights, working overtime as a teacher, weekend study sessions, none of it seemed like her. Rachel and I had been married 6 years, and while I wouldn't say it was perfect, I never doubted her loyalty. Then her behavior changed. It started small, pulling her hand away when I reached for it, brushing off my questions about her day. She was glued to her phone, smiling at texts I wasn't part of. And the nights she claimed she was too tired, too busy, well, they piled up. That night, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. I hesitated. Rachel was private about her stuff, but something didn't sit right. I picked it up, opened it, and my heart sank. The name wasn't in her contacts, just initials. But the messages didn't leave room for doubt. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. You looked amazing last time. Do you think he suspects anything? It was casual, cruel. She'd been meeting someone, her student, of all people. A boy she tutored after school, alone in her classroom. My stomach churned as the shower turned off. I put the phone down and tried to steady myself. I knew then this was going to be much bigger than I ever imagined. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, clutching my coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Rachel walked in, her hair still wet, dressed in that casual way that used to make my heart skip. "Morning," she said, kissing my cheek, oblivious. I stared at her. "We need to talk." The color drained from her face. She froze for a split second before forcing a smile. "About what?" "You tell me," I said, setting my mug down. "About your late nights? Your student? The texts?" For a moment, I thought she might deny it. But Rachel had never been good at lying under pressure. Her lip quivered, her shoulders slumped, and then came the tears. "It's not what you think," she stammered, sitting down across from me. "He needed help. He was struggling. I went too far." "Too far?" That was an understatement. My hands clenched into fists under the table. "Too far? He's a child, Rachel. How long has this been going on?" She looked away, biting her lip. "A few months. But I ended it, I swear." Her words felt hollow, like a bell tolling in an empty room. My mind raced. Had she really stopped? Could I even believe her? I thought about the texts, how fresh they were. "And what about?" My throat tightened. "What about the baby?" Her eyes widened, her breath catching. "It's yours," she whispered, as if she could will it to be true. But I couldn't believe her. Not anymore. Rachel's insistence that the baby was mine did nothing to settle the storm inside me. I didn't trust her, not anymore. Words meant nothing when she'd lied so effortlessly before. The only thing that could give me the truth was a paternity test, and I wasn't about to wait until the baby was born to start getting answers. "I need proof," I said, my voice cold and steady. Rachel flinched as if the words had struck her. "Proof?" she repeated, tears brimming in her eyes. "After everything, you really think? I think you slept with a teenage boy," I snapped, cutting her off. "And now you're carrying a child. Do you really expect me to just take your word for it?" Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. The sight might have gutted me once, but now it only fed my anger. "You have no idea what this is like," she said between sobs. "I made a mistake, a huge, horrible mistake, but I love you. I want to fix this." Her words felt like acid dripping down my spine. "You don't fix something like this, Rachel. You survive it. And I don't even know if we can do that." I stood and grabbed my keys. I couldn't be in the same room with her any longer. As I walked out the door, she called after me, begging me not to go. But I didn't look back. I had a lab to visit. The clinic was cold and impersonal, but I didn't care. I sat in the waiting room with a grim determination, my mind replaying the last few days over and over like a broken record. When they called my name, I followed the technician into a small room where they explained the process. Rachel would need to provide a sample, too. There was no getting around involving her in this. That night I told her. She cried again, pleaded with me to trust her, but I didn't budge. The next morning, we went to the clinic together. The drive was silent, the tension between us so thick it was suffocating. I could barely stand to look at her. She, on the other hand, looked small and fragile, clutching her hands in her lap like a child awaiting punishment. "I'm doing this for us," she whispered as we parked. I didn't respond. There was no us anymore, just the wreckage of what we had been. The results took weeks to come back, and every day felt like an eternity. Rachel continued to live in the house, but we were strangers under the same roof. She tried to talk to me, to bridge the gap, but I wasn't interested. I avoided her as much as I could, retreating into work, spending hours at the gym, and crashing on the couch when I couldn't bring myself to face the bed we used to share. Then the email came. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking as I clicked it open. The words blurred together, but one phrase stood out like a scream in the dark. Paternity cannot be confirmed. It wasn't mine. The baby wasn't mine. My breath left my body like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then the rage hit me, white-hot and all-consuming. She had lied to me again, betrayed me on a level I hadn't thought possible. And now she was carrying a child that wasn't mine, a child she'd conceived with her student. I stormed into the house, the test results still open on my phone. Rachel was in the living room, folding baby clothes that she'd apparently bought in some twisted attempt to act like everything was normal. "It's his, isn't it?" I said, my voice low and dangerous. She froze, the blood draining from her face. "What?" she whispered. "You heard me." I threw my phone onto the coffee table, the email glaring up at her like an accusation. "The baby. It's his." Rachel's lip trembled, and she sank onto the couch as if her legs had given out. I didn't know," she admitted, tears spilling down her cheeks. I hoped. "Don't lie to me," I roared, and she flinched as if I'd struck her. "You knew. You had to know. Or were you just planning to let me raise another man's kid and hope I never found out?" She sobbed, her hands covering her face. "I didn't know what to do," she cried. "I was scared, okay? I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, incredulous. "You slept with him, Rachel." Repeatedly. "And now you're pregnant with his child. That doesn't just happen." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. My hands were trembling with fury, and my chest felt like it was about to explode. I couldn't stand to look at her anymore. I turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me. That night I didn't come home. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. I thought about the boy, this kid who had ruined my marriage, my life. I thought about Rachel and her pathetic excuses, her crocodile tears. And I thought about the baby, this innocent life caught in the middle of a storm it didn't create. I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my car in the empty parking lot of a diner, staring at the neon lights reflecting off the rain-soaked asphalt. The anger burned inside me, a living, breathing thing that demanded action. Rachel and her boy toy might have thought they could destroy my life and walk away unscathed, but they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them off that easy. The next morning, I began my plan. It started with research. I needed to know everything about the boy, his name, his family, his life outside of school. I already had some of the details from snooping through Rachel's phone before she caught on and changed her passwords, but now I needed more. A quick trip to her school's staff directory gave me his full name. From there, it wasn't hard to dig deeper. His name was Kyle Matthews. A senior. 18, barely. He came from a broken home, his mom working 2 jobs to keep the lights on while his dad was serving time for a DUI that had turned into a manslaughter charge. A troubled kid. Vulnerable. It made sense why Rachel might have been drawn to him. She always had a soft spot for lost causes. But this time, her bleeding heart had crossed a line, and now we were all paying the price. I found his social media profiles, standard teenage stuff. Selfies at the gym, a few posts about his favorite bands, and a suspicious number of cryptic "Nobody understands me" captions. But then there were the photos with Rachel. Subtle, sure, but they were there. A picture of her classroom taken from his perspective, the corner of her desk just visible in the frame. A selfie outside a coffee shop with her reflection faintly visible in the window behind him. It was enough to confirm what I already knew. Now I had proof. But proof wasn't enough. I needed to hit him where it hurt. And Rachel? She wouldn't walk away unscathed either. That evening I returned home. Rachel was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove like everything was normal. The sight of her standing there, so casual, so unbothered, made my blood boil. "You're home," she said softly, glancing at me over her shoulder. I was starting to worry. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past her, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat at the kitchen table. She turned off the stove and joined me, sitting across from me with a wary expression. "I know you're angry," she began, her voice trembling. "And you have every right to be. But I meant what I said. I want to fix this." I snorted, taking a long sip of my beer. "Fix this?" I echoed. "You think you can fix this? You're carrying his child, Rachel. Every time I look at you, all I see is him." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. Let her cry. She deserved it. "I can't change what happened," she whispered. "But I can be better. I want to be better, for you, for the baby." The audacity of it all made me laugh, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the kitchen. "Better?" I said, shaking my head. "You're delusional if you think there's any coming back from this." She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, standing up and grabbing my keys. "But I know one thing, you're going to regret every choice you made." Before she could respond, I was out the door. Over the next few days, I started planting the seeds of my revenge. I anonymously tipped off the school board about Rachel's inappropriate relationship with a student. I attached screenshots of the messages I had found and photos from Kyle's social media. I knew it was only a matter of time before the administration would be forced to act. Then I turned my attention to Kyle. Using a burner account, I messaged him on Instagram, pretending to be a fellow student from another school who admired his bad boy vibe. I baited him into a conversation, subtly steering it toward Rachel. It didn't take long before he started bragging about their relationship, clearly oblivious to who he was really talking to. He sent me pictures, ones I hadn't seen before, of them together at a park, in her car, even one where they were lying on a bed I recognized as our guest room. The rage I felt was almost blinding. My hands trembled as I saved the images, each one fueling the fire inside me. But I kept my cool. I needed to be patient. The fallout began a week later. Rachel came home from school in tears, clutching a letter in her hands. She had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into allegations of misconduct. Her career, the thing she had worked so hard for, was crumbling before her eyes. "How could they do this to me?" she sobbed, pacing the living room. "I gave everything to that school. I cared about my students. You destroyed yourself," I said coldly, cutting her off. "You have no one to blame but yourself." She turned to me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Was it you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Did you do this?" I stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us until it was unbearable. Finally I said, "What do you think?" Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, her sobs growing louder. But I didn't feel pity. Only satisfaction. She deserved this. And I wasn't done yet. Rachel spiraled in the days following her suspension. She barely left the couch, her once perfectly composed exterior crumbling into a fragile mess. She had always been the polished one, the professional. Watching her unravel brought a dark satisfaction I wasn't proud of but couldn't ignore. Still, I wasn't done. Not even close. The investigation at her school gained momentum quickly. Parents whispered, teachers distanced themselves, and the local news caught wind of the scandal. A headline scrolled across my phone one morning. Beloved teacher accused of inappropriate relationship with student. It was only a matter of time before the story spread. Her colleagues, friends, even her family began calling incessantly. Rachel barely answered, retreating further into herself. She'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at her phone as if willing it to stop ringing. The stress started showing. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her once confident posture sagged under the weight of her guilt. She tried to talk to me, to beg for forgiveness, but her voice was weaker now, desperate. "I never meant to hurt you," she said one night as I sat on the couch, pretending to read an article on my phone. "I swear I didn't think." "You didn't think at all," I snapped, not even looking up. "And now everyone knows who you really are." Her sobs were loud and raw, but they didn't reach me. I was past feeling sympathy. While Rachel crumbled, I turned my attention to Kyle. I wanted to make sure he felt the weight of his actions too. I sent the photos he'd carelessly shared with me to his school anonymously. His cocky attitude would only take him so far when the administration saw proof of his involvement in Rachel's downfall. Within days, Kyle's life began to unravel as well. He was called into meetings with school officials, his mother was summoned to the principal's office, and his classmates started whispering about the scandal. He deleted his social media accounts, likely realizing too late that they had been his undoing. The final blow came when the police got involved. While Rachel's suspension was public, Kyle's role as a student in the affair was a serious legal matter. Statutory laws didn't care about whether he was a consenting adult. Rachel was in a position of power, and that was all they needed to press charges. I sat in my car outside the house one morning, watching as a police cruiser pulled into the driveway and 2 officers walked up to the door. Rachel didn't return home that night. It should have felt like a victory, but as I sat in the now empty house, the silence was suffocating. Rachel's things were still scattered everywhere: her books, her clothes, even the ultrasound photos she'd printed out and left on the kitchen counter. I stared at them, the weight of everything pressing down on me. She had destroyed us, but in doing so, she'd left me hollow. My life was unrecognizable, shattered into jagged pieces that didn't fit together anymore. The whispers in town grew louder as the scandal unfolded. People I'd once called friends avoided me, unsure how to approach the man whose wife had caused such a public catastrophe. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, but most simply stayed silent. Weeks later, Rachel's lawyer reached out. She wanted to meet. At first, I laughed at the idea. What could she possibly have to say that would make a difference? But curiosity got the better of me. We met at a dingy diner on the outskirts of town, where no one would recognize us. She looked rough. Her once perfectly styled hair hung limp around her face, and her clothes were baggy, as if she'd shrunk under the weight of her own shame. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice trembling. "How about explaining why you thought any of this was a good idea?" I shot back. Rachel flinched but didn't argue. "I wasn't thinking," she admitted. "I was lost. I felt disconnected, from you, from myself. Kyle was, he was there, and I made the worst mistake of my life." "You mean mistakes?" I corrected, leaning back in the booth. "Plural." She looked down at her hands, tears pooling in her eyes. "I deserve that. I deserve everything that's happened. But I didn't ask you here to make excuses." "Then why am I here?" I asked, my voice cold. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. I hesitated before picking it up, unfolding it slowly. It was a letter, a handwritten apology to me, to the school, to Kyle's family. Her words were raw, unpolished. She admitted everything: the affair, the lies, the betrayal. At the bottom, she wrote, "I'm ready to face whatever consequences come my way. But I hope one day you can forgive me, not for me, but for yourself." I tossed the letter back onto the table. "You think this fixes anything?" I asked, my voice rising. You think this erases the months of lies, the humiliation, the destruction of everything we built? No, she said quietly. But it's all I can do. I stood abruptly, throwing a few bills on the table for my coffee. Good luck with your redemption arc, I said bitterly. But don't expect me to be part of it. As I walked out of the diner, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Was it relief? Closure? I didn't know. All I knew was that I wasn't done. There was one last thing I needed to do. Rachel's apology letter haunted me for days after our meeting. Not because I believed her words or felt any sympathy for her. It was the audacity of it, the way she tried to wrap her betrayal in a neat little bow of regret, as if her confession absolved her of everything she'd done. But regret wasn't justice. I wasn't ready to let her move on so easily. I needed to ensure that what she'd done stayed with her forever, just as it would with me. Kyle was my next target. Rachel's ruin had been cathartic, but I wasn't about to let her accomplice walk away unscathed. After the investigation into Rachel's misconduct began, Kyle had managed to lay low. He withdrew from school, no doubt under his mother's guidance, and rumors swirled about whether he'd return for his senior year. But there was one thing I knew about boys like Kyle: they weren't made for shame. Eventually they'd slip up. I found my opening when a friend at the local gym, a place Kyle frequented, mentioned overhearing him bragging about dodging the fallout of the scandal. The smug little bastard thought he'd gotten away with everything, that he could bury his role in the affair and move on. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Using the evidence I'd gathered, screenshots, photos, and a particularly damning text exchange where Kyle had boasted about his special relationship with Rachel, I compiled a report and sent it to every media outlet that had covered the story. I framed it as a public interest piece. What happens when the victim is no angel? I didn't stop there. I sent copies to his future college admissions office, local community leaders, and even his church. By the time the article gained traction, Kyle's face was plastered across social media, not as an innocent teenager caught in an adult's web, but as an active participant in a scandal that had rocked the community. His life, once full of potential, began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. As the fallout from Kyle's exposure gained momentum, I started noticing the cracks in Rachel's defenses grow deeper. She'd been released on bail, but the trial loomed over her like a dark cloud. She stayed with her parents now, hiding from the town that once adored her. Even her own family seemed to look at her differently, their support eroding as the full scope of her actions came to light. One night, Rachel called me. Her number flashing on my phone was like a jolt of electricity. I debated ignoring it but decided to pick up. Her voice was shaky, exhausted. "Please," she said. "I just need to talk." I didn't answer. I let her ramble, her words tumbling over one another like a desperate stream. "They're saying I might lose the baby," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "The stress, the damage I've done, it's all too much. I don't know what to do." For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me. Not sympathy. Rachel had made her bed, and she was lying in it, but something colder. A realization. She was broken, stripped down to nothing, and while it wasn't my job to fix her, it was enough to know that she understood the depths of what she'd done. "Is that supposed to make me feel sorry for you?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "You made these choices, Rachel. And now you're paying for them," she cried, her sobs quiet but piercing. "I just wanted to fix it. To fix us." "There is no us," I said flatly. "There hasn't been since the moment you decided to throw it all away." I hung up without waiting for her response. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing as Rachel arrived, flanked by her lawyer and her parents. She looked gaunt, her once vibrant appearance replaced by a hollow shell of the woman I had once loved. I watched from the back of the courtroom as the proceedings unfolded. Kyle was called to testify, his demeanor shifting between defiance and discomfort as the prosecution tore through his story. Rachel sat silently, her head bowed, as the details of her betrayal were laid bare for the court to hear. When the verdict came down, guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, I felt a strange sense of closure. She was sentenced to prison time and barred from ever teaching again. Her life as she'd known it was over. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle. The town moved on, finding new scandals to whisper about, new dramas to dissect. Rachel's absence was like a void, her name now synonymous with disgrace. Kyle disappeared as well, his family relocating to avoid the fallout. And me? I tried to rebuild. I threw myself into work, surrounded myself with friends who reminded me that life could still hold meaning. But the scars remained. Every time I walked past the empty nursery we'd planned for the baby, I felt the weight of everything that had been lost. Every time someone mentioned Rachel's name, it was like reopening a wound that hadn't fully healed. One evening, as I sat alone in the house, the silence pressing down on me, I received a letter. It was from Rachel, mailed from the prison. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy with her handwriting. I debated throwing it away but ultimately decided to read it. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she wrote. "I don't even expect you to respond. But I need you to know that I am sorry, truly sorry. Not just for what I did to you, but for the person I became. I hope one day you can find peace, even if it's without me." I set the letter aside, unsure how to feel. Her words didn't change anything, but they didn't need to. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I was just looking to move forward. Months turned into a year, and life slowly began to settle into a semblance of normalcy. The house that Rachel and I had shared no longer felt like a tomb of memories. Instead, it became a blank canvas for rebuilding. I redecorated, tossing out furniture we had chosen together, and replacing it with things that were just mine. It was cathartic, a small step toward reclaiming what had been taken. My job became my anchor. Late nights at the office, endless projects, and the hum of productivity kept my mind from wandering to darker places. But even as I moved forward, the whispers of the past lingered. People still knew me as the guy whose wife had the affair, and though they rarely said it to my face, I could feel the pity in their eyes. It didn't matter. Let them whisper. I had survived the worst, and nothing they said could break me now. One unexpected development came in the form of an old friend, Mark, a college buddy I hadn't seen in years. He reached out of the blue after hearing about what had happened. "I figured you could use a change of scenery," he said over the phone. "Why don't you come visit? Clear your head." Mark lived 3 states away, near a serene lakeside town that sounded like a perfect escape. On a whim, I packed a bag and drove out, leaving behind the weight of my old life for a few days of reprieve. The trip was exactly what I needed. Mark's laughter, his no-nonsense advice, and the peaceful rhythm of the lake helped me realize something. I had been stuck in survival mode for too long. It was time to stop merely existing and start living again. When I returned home, I made a list. Nothing fancy, just a set of goals I wanted to accomplish for myself. Run a marathon. Learn to cook something other than spaghetti. Take a vacation abroad. It seemed silly at first, but it gave me purpose. One by one, I tackled the items on my list. Running became my therapy, the pounding of my feet against the pavement drowning out the noise in my head. I signed up for a cooking class and learned to make an incredible beef bourguignon, which I proudly shared with friends during a small dinner party. And a few months later, I found myself in Paris, standing under the Eiffel Tower, marveling at how far I'd come. For the first time in years, I felt free. Then came the letter. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that begged for a quiet evening with a book and a glass of whiskey. The return address made my stomach tighten. It was from Rachel. She hadn't written since the first letter she sent from prison, and I had assumed she wouldn't again. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "I'm being released soon," she wrote. "The prison counselor suggested I reach out to the people I've hurt as part of my healing process. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I'd like to meet, just once. There are things I need to say in person, and I think there are things you need to say, too. If you're willing, please let me know. If not, I understand." I stared at the letter for a long time. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to banish her and everything she represented from my life forever. But another part, a quieter, more rational part, knew that I still carried pieces of her betrayal like a weight around my neck. Maybe this meeting wasn't for her. Maybe it was for me. The coffee shop we met in was small and tucked away, chosen deliberately to avoid prying eyes. Rachel walked in wearing plain jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look far younger, and far more vulnerable, than I remembered. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat across from me. "I'm not here for you," I replied, my tone flat. "Say what you need to say." She winced but nodded. For the next hour, she talked. About her time in prison, the therapy sessions that had forced her to confront her own demons, and the guilt that she said consumed her every day. "I can't undo what I did," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know that. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. And I hope that one day, you can find it in your heart to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours." I let her words hang in the air, unsure how to respond. Forgiveness? It felt like an impossible concept. But as I looked at her, this broken, humbled version of the woman I had once loved, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't consumed by the need for revenge. I had moved past her, past the pain she caused. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about absolving her. Maybe it was about freeing myself. "I don't hate you anymore," I said finally, surprising myself with the truth in my words. "But I don't forgive you either. Maybe I will someday. Maybe I won't. Either way, it doesn't matter. You're not a part of my life anymore." Rachel nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. And with that, we parted ways. Walking out of the coffee shop, I felt lighter. The past would always be there, a shadow lurking at the edges of my mind. But it no longer defined me. My life was mine again, and for the first time, I was ready to embrace it fully. The encounter with Rachel was the last piece of the puzzle I hadn't realized I needed. When I walked out of that coffee shop, it felt like I was leaving more than just her behind. I was leaving behind the weight of my anger, my need for justice, and the bitterness that had gripped me for so long. The world felt brighter, the air lighter, as if I'd shed a skin that no longer fit. I started focusing on my future instead of obsessing over my past. My job had been my crutch throughout everything, but now it became a stepping stone. I applied for a promotion, one that would involve leading a new team in a different city. It was a bold move, but it felt right. When the offer came through, I didn't hesitate. A fresh start in a new place was exactly what I needed. The new city was bustling and unfamiliar, which suited me perfectly. It forced me out of my comfort zone, away from the memories that clung to my old life. My colleagues were warm and welcoming, and I quickly found myself thriving in the new role. I poured my energy into the work, earning respect and forming bonds that went beyond professional camaraderie. One of those bonds stood out, Mia, a fellow team lead with a sharp wit and an easy laugh. She was different from Rachel in every way, grounded, straightforward, and refreshingly honest. At first, we were just friends, grabbing coffee after meetings or sharing jokes during late-night work sessions. But over time, something deeper began to grow. I wasn't ready to date again, not really. The scars Rachel left weren't fully healed, and the idea of opening myself up to someone felt like walking into a minefield. But Mia was patient. She didn't push, didn't demand more than I could give. Instead, she became my anchor, reminding me that not every relationship was destined to end in betrayal. The first time I told her about Rachel, we were sitting on a bench overlooking the city skyline. It was late, the air cool, and the lights twinkling in the distance felt like a million promises waiting to be fulfilled. "I was married," I said, my voice hesitant. "It ended badly." Mia didn't pry. She simply nodded, her expression soft. "Do you want to talk about it?" And so, I told her. Not everything, just enough to explain the weight I still carried. She listened without judgment, her hand resting gently on mine as I spoke. When I finished, she gave my hand a squeeze. Thank you for trusting me with that, she said quietly. But you're not your past, you know. You're more than what happened to you. Her words stayed with me long after that night. Mia and I started dating officially a few months later. It wasn't perfect, we both had our baggage, but it was honest. We communicated in a way I never had with Rachel, and slowly, I began to rebuild my faith in love. She taught me to laugh again, to find joy in the small moments, and to believe that happiness wasn't just something other people got to have. One evening, as we walked hand in hand through a park near my new apartment, Mia stopped suddenly and turned to me. You seem lighter these days, she said, a smile playing on her lips. Happier. I thought about her words and realized she was right. The shadows of my past no longer loomed so large. They were still there, but they no longer consumed me. I think I am, I replied, squeezing her hand. And it's because of you. As life with Mia blossomed, the pieces of my life that Rachel had shattered slowly fell into place. I sold the old house and used the money to travel, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the courage to pursue. Mia joined me for some trips, and on others, I went alone, rediscovering myself in places I'd only dreamed of visiting. One particularly transformative trip was to Iceland. Standing at the edge of a massive glacier, surrounded by the raw beauty of nature, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Life wasn't about avoiding pain or erasing scars. It was about finding beauty in the mess, about moving forward even when the path wasn't clear. Back home, I took one final step toward closing the chapter on Rachel. I went through the remaining items I'd kept in storage, old photos, mementos of our life together, and the baby things she'd bought. I donated most of it, keeping only a small box of photos as a reminder of the lessons I'd learned. There was no anger left, no bitterness. Just acceptance. Months later, as Mia and I sat on my balcony, watching the sunset, she leaned her head on my shoulder. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? She asked. I thought about it for a moment, my heart swelling with gratitude for how far I'd come. Here, I said. With you. She smiled, and in that moment I knew that while the scars of my past would always remain, they no longer defined me. I was free. The next few years were a blur of growth and discovery. Life, which had once seemed like a dark tunnel with no end in sight, was now full of light and possibility. Mia and I grew closer, building a relationship rooted in trust and understanding. It wasn't perfect, we had our disagreements, our moments of doubt, but it was real. And that made all the difference. One day, as we strolled through the city's botanical gardens, Mia brought up a topic we hadn't broached before. Have you ever thought about having kids? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes searching. The question stopped me in my tracks. Kids? The very thought sent a flurry of emotions through me, excitement, fear, and a lingering shadow of grief from what could have been. Rachel's pregnancy had been a devastating turning point in my life, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face that part of myself again. I don't know, I admitted, taking her hand. I've thought about it, but it's complicated. Mia didn't press. She simply nodded and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. We don't have to decide right now, she said. But if it's something you want someday, I'd like to be a part of it. Her words stayed with me. For the first time in years, I began to imagine a future that included children. A future where I could give love freely, without the baggage of my past weighing me down. Mia and I didn't rush things. We continued to grow individually and together, taking time to ensure we were building a solid foundation. A year later, on a quiet evening at the beach, I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me. Her answer was an enthusiastic yes, followed by tears of joy and laughter as we celebrated under the stars. Our wedding was small and intimate, a celebration of love and resilience. My parents, who had supported me through the darkest times, stood beaming in the front row. Mark, my college buddy who had helped me rediscover myself, gave a toast that left everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. And Mia, radiant in a simple white dress, looked at me like I was the only man in the world. For the first time, I felt like I had truly found my place. After the wedding, life settled into a new rhythm. We bought a cozy house on the outskirts of the city, complete with a garden that Mia adored and a home office where I could focus on my growing career. It wasn't long before the conversation about kids resurfaced, and this time, I was ready. "I want to try," I told Mia one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "I want to be a dad." Her smile was brighter than the setting sun. "Then let's do it." The journey wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments of fear as I grappled with the scars Rachel had left. But Mia's unwavering support made all the difference. She reminded me that I wasn't the same person I had been back then. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the challenges ahead. When Mia told me she was pregnant, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: joy, fear, excitement, and a deep sense of gratitude. This time, it was different. This time, it was real. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. We turned one of the spare bedrooms into a nursery, complete with soft pastel walls and a crib that I painstakingly assembled one Saturday afternoon. Mia and I attended parenting classes together, laughing at our clumsy attempts to swaddle baby dolls and change diapers. Every step brought us closer, not just to our baby but to each other. The day our daughter was born was the most overwhelming and beautiful day of my life. Holding her tiny, squirming body in my arms, I felt an indescribable love, a love that eclipsed all the pain and heartbreak I'd endured. She was perfect, and in that moment I knew that every step of my journey had led me to this. We named her Lily, after Mia's favorite flower. Watching her grow was like seeing the world through new eyes. Her laughter was infectious, her curiosity boundless. She brought light to every corner of our lives, reminding me daily of how far I'd come. One quiet evening, as I rocked Lily to sleep, I thought about Rachel. Not with anger or resentment, but with a sense of finality. Her betrayal had once defined me, shaped the darkest chapter of my life. But now, it was just a memory, a story I rarely revisited. I didn't need to hold on to it anymore. My life was full of love, joy, and purpose. The wounds she had inflicted had healed, leaving behind scars that no longer hurt. Mia found me sitting in the nursery, Lily asleep in my arms. She knelt beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "You look at peace," she said softly. "I think I am," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. "For the first time in a long time, I really am. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. If you'd asked me years ago, during the darkest days of my life, if I'd ever find happiness again, I would have laughed bitterly at the thought. Back then, it felt like I was drowning in betrayal, anger, and loss, unable to imagine a future where I could breathe freely. But now, as I stood in my backyard, watching Lily chase bubbles across the grass while Mia laughed beside her, I realized how wrong I had been. This was happiness. This was peace. The years flew by. Lily grew into a precocious, joyful child, her laughter filling every corner of our home. She inherited Mia's curiosity and my stubborn streak, a combination that often left us shaking our heads and smiling in equal measure. Watching her discover the world was a reminder of how beautiful life could be, even after so much pain. Mia and I grew stronger together, our bond deepening with each passing year. We learned how to navigate life's challenges as a team, supporting each other through sleepless nights, stressful work deadlines, and the occasional tantrum, Lily's and our own. Ours wasn't a perfect love, but it was an honest one, a love forged in trust, respect, and the hard-earned lessons of our pasts. One afternoon, as I sorted through some old boxes in the attic, I came across a photo album I hadn't seen in years. It was from my first marriage, a relic of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The pictures were faded, the smiles frozen in a time that no longer existed. I hesitated for a moment before flipping through the pages. There we were, Rachel and I, on our wedding day, on vacations, in the early years of our life together. The images didn't sting as they once might have. Instead, they felt distant, like watching a movie you'd long since forgotten. I lingered on one photo of Rachel smiling brightly, her arms wrapped around me as we stood on a beach. "I hope you found your peace," I murmured, closing the album and setting it aside. I didn't need those memories anymore. They were part of my story, but they didn't define me. My life wasn't about the pain of the past. It was about the joy of the present and the promise of the future. Mia found me later that evening, sitting on the porch with a glass of wine. She joined me, her hands slipping into mine as we watched the sun dip below the horizon. "Something on your mind?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I replied, glancing at her with a smile. "How far I've come?" Mia tilted her head, studying me with a soft expression. "Do you ever think about it? The past?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not the way I used to. It's like a scar. You know it's there, but it doesn't hurt anymore." She squeezed my hand. "You've come a long way." "We both have," I said, kissing her temple. "And I'm grateful every day that I found you." As the years went on, I continued to build the life I had once thought impossible. Lily grew into a kind, determined young woman, filling our home with her energy and love. Mia and I found joy in the simple things: family dinners, lazy Sundays, and the quiet comfort of knowing we had weathered life's storms together. One evening, as we celebrated Lily's high school graduation, I found myself reflecting on everything that had brought me to this moment. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, they were chapters in my story, but they weren't the whole book. The rest of the story was about resilience, love, and the power of starting over. Years later, as I stood in a hospital room holding my first grandchild, I realized I had come full circle. The baby in my arms was a reminder of how life goes on, how it renews itself even after the darkest moments. I glanced at Mia, who stood beside me with tears of joy in her eyes, and I smiled. We had built something beautiful from the ashes of the past. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. Looking back, I see now that life isn't about avoiding pain or betrayal. It's about finding the strength to rise again, to open yourself to the possibility of joy, even when it feels impossible. My journey was messy and painful, but it led me here, to a life filled with love, laughter, and hope. And that, I think, is the greatest revenge of all. Not bitterness or anger, but living well. A life rebuilt. A life worth living.